Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. This is Bridge City News. Here are some of the top stories we've been following. Amidst speculation, Foreign Affairs Minister Melany Joly says no to leaving her post and running for leader of the Liberal Party. Plus, the sentencing hearing continues today for two men accused of leading the Coutts border blockade during the pandemic. And Donald Trump receives an unconditional discharge in the hush money trial.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Jeanette Roche.
Thanks so much for joining us. The rules have been established for the federal Liberal Party election. The party's National Board of Directors met Thursday night to decide the regulations for the race to succeed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who announced Monday he would resign as soon as a new leader is chosen. The federal Liberals will choose their next leader on March 9th, meaning that person would only have 2 weeks left on the prorogued period before Parliament heads back into session March 24th. The cutoff date for candidates deciding to run is January 23rd, and they will have to pay a $350,000 registration fee. To vote for the next leader, you must be registered with the party before January 27th. You must be a Canadian citizen and at least 14 years of age. Foreign Affairs Minister Melany Joly is bowing out of the race to replace Trudeau as Liberal leader, making her the second cabinet minister to choose their current job over the chance to run for Prime Minister. Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc ruled out a leadership bid earlier this week. Joly says that while she's ready to become the first female leader of the Liberal Party, she's not willing to leave her cabinet posting at a, quote, crucial time for Canada-U.S. relations.
Over the last couple of days, I've had lots of good conversation with my team, with my key organizers. I've received a lot of support from across the country, and I wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to all these supporters. But essentially, I had to ask myself two questions. The first one is, am I ready to be the first woman to lead the Liberal Party of Canada? And the answer is yes. And am I ready, at the same time, to step away from my responsibilities as Minister of Foreign Affairs at a time where it is a crucial time in the Canada-U.S. relationship? And the answer is no. And the reality is I can't do both. So I'm heading into the Canada-U.S. Committee in the Cabinet room, and we will be talking about retaliatory measures against potential tariffs from President-elect Trump, and we will be ready.
Joly will head to Washington, D.C. next week to press the incoming U.S. administration not to impose damaging tariffs. She confirmed her travel plans this morning as she headed into that committee meeting. This comes as Donald Trump has threatened to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods when he's inaugurated later this month. Meantime, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says the top election issue remains the carbon tax, despite threats of hefty tariffs on Canadian goods by the U.S.
It's ironic we have an American president who's threatening tariffs on Canada, and we have a Canadian government that is threatening even more devastating tariffs on Canada in the form of a carbon tax that will rise to 61 cents a litre. You know, the only person that would like the Canadian carbon tax to go to 61 cents a litre more than the NDP Liberals is President Trump, because he'll be on the phone with our trucking companies, our factories, our mines. He'll be saying, pick up your billions of dollars and move 50 kilometers south, create the jobs for Americans, and leave the carbon tax behind. In the words of Ross Perot, there'll be a large sucking sound of Canadian business jobs and money pouring out of our country as America has no carbon tax and their other taxes will be dropping while we're imposing this devastating economic vandalism on our businesses and workers.
Certain U.S. products could be hit with a retaliatory tariff in response to threats of hefty duties on Canadian imports by the incoming Trump administration. Products like American steel, ceramics, plastics, and orange juice could be on the list. A senior government official says Ottawa has made no final decisions on possible retaliation. With more explanation, here is Kyle Dugan with the Canadian Press.
What some of my sources have told me is that this is a better approach than if we were to actually make a similar threat to what Trump has done with across-the-board tariffs. I spoke with Matthew Holmes from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and Laura Dawson, who is another Smart Canada U.S. trade expert, and they both told me, we don't want to get into a protracted trade war with the U.S., certainly not by threatening these kind of large having some bravado and just saying, we'll also have 25% tariffs, because that would immediately invite escalation, and that's a war that we can't win.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada will never become the 51st state after escalating jabs from President-elect Donald Trump. In Washington, for former President Jimmy Carter's funeral, Trudeau says Canada and the U.S. are better off when they work together as Trump threatens hefty tariffs on Canadian imports.
The issue, of course, of Canada-U.S. relations also came up a number of times today. When it comes to Canada being looked at as the 51st state, let me just state it again, that's never going to happen. Canadians define themselves a whole bunch of different ways, but one of the ways that we all use as shorthand is we're Canadian because we're not American. And that is not going to change. We're going to continue to stand up for the interests of workers and consumers on both sides of the border, because there is no relationship in the world like that between Canada and the United States as defined by a win-win for both of us.
And speaking of Donald Trump, the incoming president is expected to return to the business of planning for his new U.S. administration after he received no punishment from his New York hush money case. During today's sentencing hearing, Manhattan Judge Juan M. Merchan gave Trump an unconditional discharge for all 34 felony counts of falsifying business records to hide a $130,000 hush money payoff to porn actor Stormy Daniels during the 2016 election campaign. The judgment marks a quiet end to an extraordinary case that, for the first time, put a former American president and major presidential candidate in a courtroom as a criminal defendant. Trump can still vote but can't own a gun and will have to turn over a DNA sample. Trump was charged for falsifying his business records.
This court has determined that the only lawful sentence that permits entry of a judgment of conviction without encroaching upon the highest office in the land is an unconditional discharge. Therefore, at this time, I impose that sentence to cover all 34 counts. Sir, I wish you Godspeed as you assume your second term in office.
This has been a very terrible experience. I think it's been a tremendous setback for New York and the New York court system. It's been a political witch hunt. It was done to damage my reputation so that I'd lose the election, and obviously that didn't work. This has been a weaponization of government. They call it lawfare. Never happened to any extent like this, but never happened in our country before.
The defendant, the once and future President of the United States, has engaged in a coordinated campaign to undermine its legitimacy. Far from expressing any kind of remorse for his criminal conduct, the defendant has purposefully bred disdain for our judicial institutions and the rule of law.
The death toll in Los Angeles has risen to at least 10 so far, and it's estimated 10,000 homes and other structures have been destroyed. Meanwhile, a nighttime curfew has been imposed in areas impacted by the devastating wildfires blazing across Los Angeles. The rule will be in effect in the Pacific Palisades and Eaton fire areas as police warn that anyone involved in, quote, despicable looting will be arrested. In an interview Thursday with our U.S. correspondent, Lisa Daftari described some of the devastating acts that have been taking place across fire-ravaged Los Angeles.
There's been looting, and there's been upwards of 20 or 30 people who have been arrested for looting and taking advantage of the situation, waiting for people to evacuate, to raid their homes, to raid their businesses. Just horrific. And there have also, very, very unfortunately, we know Mother Nature has played a big role in these fires, but there have also been arsonists who are setting deliberate fires. Think about the level of evil that we're talking about here for people to actually set fires and to just stand back and watch, whether they're, doing it for insurance fraud or whether they're, homeless or whether these are, the migrants who are unhoused. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think that there is that kind of evil out there. But as I said, Jeanette, we're also seeing a lot of humanity and a lot of people coming together to help each other through this crisis.
A Canadian plane helping to fight wildfires in Los Angeles is now out of service after colliding with a civilian drone. It's a federal crime to fly a drone during firefighting. A pair of Quebec water bombers and their crews have been helping since Tuesday to fight the massive fires, which have killed at least 10 people. The LA County Fire Department says there were no injuries in the drone collision. Two men who were considered the leaders of the COVID-19 blockade at the Coutts border in Alberta during the pandemic nearly 3 years ago heard their sentences in Lethbridge Friday. Marco Van Hugenbos and George Jansen were both found guilty of mischief last year, and today Van Hugenbos was sentenced to 120 days of jail time and Jansen 90 days plus 100 hours of community service to be completed. According to the justice, Jansen also is not allowed to enter the communities of Coutts or Milk River, Alberta during his 90 days. In an interview Thursday evening, Van Hugenbos and his defense attorney, Brendan Miller, said they were hoping for a discharge.
We're here, we showed up, we fought the fight that we felt was there from the beginning, ramifications aside.
As Bridge City News reported Thursday, the third man awaiting sentencing, Alex Van Herk, has fired his attorney and is now seeking new counsel. The third suspect in a Lethbridge homicide investigation who turned herself in last Friday had a court appearance Thursday. Melissa Christelle Tidland, 23 of Pincher Creek, has already retained counsel, but her court date has been adjourned until Monday. She is one of three suspects named in the Boxing Day murder of 34-year-old Christina Weber, which occurred at the Super Lodge Motel. Well, Holy Spirit Catholic School Division experienced a cybersecurity breach this week where data containing information about Holy Spirit's families and educators was compromised. The data taken primarily includes staff, parent and guardian, and student names, as well as other general demographic information. Superintendent Chantel Exani says the data company Power School has assured them this incident is now contained and adequate measures have been taken to make sure the data is safe, secure, and will not be shared. The city of Lethbridge has responded to a wastewater pipe leak in the Old Man River Valley near the university. The section is taped off to address the issue, and the city is working with Alberta Environment to put forward a response and repair plan. As of this time, no wastewater is expected to have seeped into the Old Man River, but sampling tests are being done to confirm this. Repairs are expected to last for the next 3 weeks and will close sections near the trail during the process. People are asked to avoid the area during this time. Since January 2024, Canada recognized January as Firefighter Cancer Awareness Month. This follows the International Agency for Research on Cancer classifying firefighting as a known human carcinogen in June of 2022. According to Statistics Canada, firefighters have a 9% increased risk of being diagnosed with cancer. Our BCN's Heidi Echeverria has the story for us.
Public probably doesn't realize, and nor did most of us when we got into the profession, that firefighters have about a five times the chance of getting cancer over the general public. And roughly between 75 and 90% of firefighter deaths are cancer related. So the International Agency of Cancer Research categorizes careers according to the risk of cancer, and we are at a group 1, which is as high as the ratings go.
When they are on the station, waiting to be called to attend an emergency, they remain dressed in navy blue. But just when they must become heroes, instead of wearing a cape, they put on their PPE or they turn out gear, as they call the yellow helmet, safety boots, along with pants, jacket, and other equipment. It is there where firefighters put themselves at risk to rescue others. That's why Canada is recognizing January as Firefighter Cancer Awareness Month. Warren Molnar, officer with Lethbridge Fire and Emergency Services, explains what risks they run and why.
The construction of houses and the contents inside now, the synthetic material just emanates toxic gases, the hydrocarbons all over the place. And you add that with your benzenes and your cyanic acid and your hydrocarbons and fire retardant materials. There's just a host of toxic chemicals in the fires that we fight now. And you compound that with shift work and the job stress. It just really creates an environment where firefighters are a big target for cancer.
And although being at risk is part of the job, the first responder organization is also implements security mechanisms so that its members are safe while providing service.
We follow the science as close as we can. During a fire, post-incident now we do gross decontamination. So after a fire, our gear is full of toxins, so we have to have a process to remove our gear. You'll find that firefighters have to be very careful around their wrists, around the ankles and neck, because that's where we do a lot of absorbing of these chemicals as well. It's not just inhalation.
The organization and its members never forget those who were on the front lines of the battle against fire. To that end, a wall of recognition at each of the 5 Lethbridge fire stations is honored. It bears the names of those brave men and women who are no longer with us due to cancer or other occupational death.
You know, the fire department's a big family, and we try to honor everybody that have passed. We've got names on trucks, we've got plaques, we have ceremonies every year. It does impact us hard, and that's why we take it really seriously. Any of the past firefighters that have passed away with cancer, we try to honor them, and we've labeled them on many of the fire trucks that you see around in the city. I think it's a very meaningful way that we can honor our brothers and sisters that have died before us because of cancer.
Recognizing this noble work should last more than a month. It should be done to the same extent that these brave people provide their service to the communities, the 365 days of the year. For Bridge City News, I'm Heidi Echavarria.
It was much warmer today, but windy. The Windy City really lived up to its name as we experienced those strong gusts up to 70 kilometers per hour. But will this mild and windy weather last? Well, I'll be back right after the break with a full look at that weather picture. Welcome back. Windy conditions expected tonight in Lethbridge as we see those gusts up to 70 kilometers per hour before dying down later on tonight to a mere 50 kilometers per hour. Not too bad. Yes. And then as we get into tomorrow, actually tonight, expect 2 centimeters of snow, and that's just to start out our very wet, sloppy weekend, because on Saturday also we're looking at a chance of flurries mixed with showers, and then in the evening on Saturday night, those flurries could turn into just showers before seeing a 40% chance of flurries on Sunday. So a very wet weekend ahead of us. 1 degree for the high on Saturday, 0 on Sunday, and then We get back into the sunshine on Monday. Clear skies and high of 0, up to 5 degrees on Tuesday, 8 on Wednesday, and then back to 5 on Thursday. So it's just going to be a little bit of a sloppy weekend before we get into the meltdown again next week. So average high for this time of year, -2, average low, -14. 15 degrees was our high temperature on this day back in 1928. Gosh, that's almost 100 years ago. Hard to believe. -38 was the record low back in 1909. And the sun rose this morning at 8:26. Sunset this evening at 4:52 p.m. That means we have 2 minutes more daylight today than we had yesterday. So 8 hours and 24 minutes of daylight exactly. Clear skies for the most part tomorrow in Victoria. 8 degrees for the high, mix of sun and cloud in Vancouver with a high of 6 degrees. Edmonton, 60% chance of flurries. Ending in the morning, 3 for the high there. And then in Calgary in the morning, we're seeing 30% chance of flurries mixed with showers. And then in the afternoon, another 30% chance of flurries, high of 3 degrees. As we look to the rest of the prairies, we're seeing periods of snow in both Saskatoon and Regina with highs of -6 and -4 respectively. -9 for the high tomorrow in Winnipeg with 2 to 4 centimeters of snow expected. So probably the most snowy of all the cities across the country. As we look to the central part of the country, seeing periods of snow for both Toronto and Ottawa. Toronto sitting at a lovely 0 tomorrow, -7 for the high in Ottawa. Montreal could see 2 centimeters of snow tomorrow with a high of -7. As we look into Atlantic Canada, not as much snow here. A mix of sun and cloud mostly is what we're seeing there. Fredericton -1. +1 in Halifax, same thing for Charlottetown, and a 40% chance of flurries expected in St. John's tomorrow with a high of 1. So there you have it. That is your forecast. Economists say Canada's labour market capped the year with some good news. Stats Canada's latest jobs report shattered expectations with the economy adding 91,000 jobs in December. It says the bulk of new jobs came in education, transportation, and finance, mostly in full-time work. The unemployment rate also beat expectations, falling 0.1 percentage points to 6.7%. A new report says average asking rents declined to a 17-month low across Canada at the end of last year. Rentals.ca and Urbanation say average asking rents across Canada in December were down 3.2% from the same month last year. This marks the 5th consecutive month of rent declines, but rents are still 16.8% higher than they were 5 years ago. The report shows the rental market softened in 2024 due to new apartment builds, slowing population growth, and a weakening economy. Canadian Natural Resources plans to boost its overall production by 12% this year. The Calgary-based company, oil and gas giant, says it's targeting average annual production of between 1.51 million and 1.55 million barrels of oil equivalent per day in 2025. CNRL says the growth is due in part to its previously announced acquisition of Chevron Canada's interests in the Athabasca Oil Sands Project and Duvernay Shale. The company says it plans to drill 361 crude oil and natural gas wells in the year ahead. Now here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was down 305 points on the day to finish at 24,767. The Dow was down 696 points to 41,938. The S&P 500 was down 91 to 5827, and the Nasdaq was down 317 points to finish at 19,161. West Texas Intermediate oil was up $2.65 to $76.57 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 27 cents to $3.97 US. Gold was up $24.20 to $27.15 US an ounce, and silver was up 30 cents to $31.31 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.43 per bushel. Barley is at $6.64. Canola is at $14.49, and corn is at $8.15 per bushel. Live cattle February contract was up $1.18 to $198.78. Feeder cattle were up $3.13 to $272.35. Lean hogs February contract was up 78 cents to $82.55. And the Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours at $69.30 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, the federal Liberals will choose their next leader on March 9th, meaning that person would only have 2 weeks before Parliament heads back into session March 24th. The cutoff date for candidates deciding to run is January 23rd. Meanwhile, Foreign Affairs Minister Melany Joly has said no to throwing her hat in the ring, despite speculation that she would. Coming up after the break, some people think that Canada's moral values have changed substantially over the last 60 years. Jonathan Van Maren, activist and author of How We Got Here, points to the sexual revolution and the decriminalization of abortion in Canada that has had a huge impact on our society. Plus, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. And you can visit our website anytime to check out a number of our stories and interviews.
Canada's moral values have changed substantially over the last number of decades. How did this happen, and what were the contributing factors? And is it possible to turn things around? Today's guest joins us from Tillsonburg, Ontario, Jonathan Van Maren. He is the host of the Bridgehead podcast, and he's an author, newspaper columnist, international speaker, and activist. His latest book is How We Got Here, a guide to our anti-Christian culture. Jonathan, it's great to have you with us again.
It's great to be here.
So why don't we begin with where we are at right now when it comes to the moral state of Canada and our Western society? Give us a little bit of a rundown.
Well, I think anybody in Canada who picks up a newspaper will see debates happening that are incredibly recent. So, my mother, when she attended a Canadian public school, remembers the day being opened with the Lord's Prayer. Now you see the primary debates in multiple provinces right now being about whether or not a child can be referred for a sex change without his or her parents knowing it, about what kind of things can be taught to children. Can we teach LGBT education in schools, yes or no? Can we do it with the parents' knowledge or without their knowledge? We're seeing in Ontario that it's more controversial for a Roman Catholic school not to fly a transgender flag than it is for them to fly one. And we currently have a prime minister that campaigns at every opportunity on issues like abortion and is incredibly fixated on Canada's abortion regime, which permits abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. And so the reason I called my book How We Got Here is because I've heard this question more times than I can count over the last 10 years, as people picking up the newspaper in Canada don't recognize the country they find in its pages.
And you start your book about writing about the sexual revolution. Just talk about a little bit about when and how did this start?
So the sexual revolution is incredibly important to understand because when we look at how things change, there's often the sense of inevitability that our culture is in a state of decline, that civilizations rise and fall, and we happen to be on the downswing. And so in order for Christians and really anybody to understand how we got to this point, we need to understand the historical chronology of how we went from a culture based on Judeo-Christian values to a culture based on the values of the sexual revolution. And the answer to that question is quite long and extensive because there's many different intellectuals who have shaped the views that we now see surging to the surface of our culture. So the idea of gender ideology, this idea that gender is a spectrum rather than a sex binary, was first invented about 120 years ago by a scholar named Magnus Hirschfeld, who never saw his views achieve the mainstream in his lifetime, but are now a standard point of debate, of course, in Alberta politics. We saw this recently with Premier Danielle Smith, with Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. Even in Ontario, that debate is starting to take place. But I think for Canadians to get an easy understanding of how the sexual revolution came to Canada, it would be to look at the transformation of our country between the two Trudeaus. If I had to pick a political starting point in this country, it would be when Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the current Prime Minister's father, passed the Omnibus Bill in 1969, which decriminalized a range of sexual practices, inaugurated no-fault divorce, and decriminalized abortion. This, of course, was accompanied by a radical shift in what was being taught at universities, which groomed an entire generation into new values.
So a Trudeau is a Trudeau. And a significant part of the sexual revolution was the introduction of birth control, especially the pill. How did this impact our society?
Well, it's really interesting that you mention that because there have been multiple areas of sort of sexual libertinism throughout history, but these were confined by the reality that sex makes babies, as sex education once used to teach in public schools, and that if a society threw off all moral boundaries on sexuality, you would see essentially the breakdown of the social structure, which was founded on the institution of the family. But the sexual revolution, these new ideas were coming to fruition in the 60s and 70s, just as the birth control appeared on the scene. And so the reason the sexual revolution of the 60s and the 70s and beyond succeeded where previous attempts at sexual revolution failed is because there was this technology that promised, falsely as it turned out, that you could actually separate sex from procreation. And of course, because that was not the case, we saw every country where contraception and birth control became commonly used eventually legalize abortion about a decade later, because of course, babies are a result of sex. And when those babies are unwanted in a culture that practices sex recreationally, those babies end up being killed by abortionists in clinics that are in this country funded by our government.
And let's talk a little bit more about abortion because depending on what media you're looking at, there's some headlines out there that will show abortion as the leading cause of death worldwide by far. Now, other media will omit abortion as a cause of death, but it's still sobering that that abortion ranks so high as a leading cause of death. How did we get here?
This is a very, very salient point, and I'm glad you mentioned that piece of data specifically, because in 2023, at least 42 million children were killed by abortion. Now, let's put this into context for a moment. Every developed nation right now is experiencing what's referred to as a baby bust. There's been a massive drop-off in demographics. Again, the decision of people to avoid having children, to choose to stay single permanently, or to abort their children has resulted in populations that are not reproducing themselves full stop. And nations without children fundamentally are nations without a future. And so we're seeing these crises hit virtually every Western nation and a number of non-Western nations as well. And this is brought about by the sexual revolution. It was the idea that one could have sex without making babies and that birth control and contraception permitted people to do that. Now, of course, when people think they can do something without consequences, they practice that more, which actually resulted in more pregnancies rather than fewer. Over 50% of people who are going to have an abortion were actually using contraception when they got pregnant. And so, of course, there's a direct link between the catastrophic number of abortions happening globally every year and the crises that are now gripping almost every Western country. 42 million people is the average population of a country. So we're killing the average of about one country per year worldwide.
Now, it's interesting that you said that we're in a baby bust. Now, we have baby boomers out there. Why hasn't anyone coined the phrase baby busters and used that to describe Gen Y or Gen Z?
You know, some of your viewers might remember a book that came out around 2010 by Mark Steyn called America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It, where he described the demographic crisis that was looming. And at the time, he was kind of laughed off by quite a few people. But what we're seeing recently now is that mainstream newspapers, even here in Canada, are tackling this almost incessantly. The Globe and Mail, the CBC, CTV, mainstream news sources are saying Canadians are not having children. Our population is shrinking. What does this lead to? Well, let me give you one salient example that addresses another issue I have a chapter on in my book. The children of a nation are the ones who grow up, become taxpayers, and pay into the social welfare system that many vulnerable Canadians depend on. When we do not have those taxpayers arriving on the scene and contributing to the system, we end up having an overloaded healthcare system that can simply no longer provide the services that vulnerable Canadians need. And so what you have when you have a baby bust and an abortion regime is inevitably euthanasia and assisted suicide, where in Canada, just during Trudeau's tenure, we've seen 60,000 Canadians die by euthanasia, over 15,000 last year. About half of those Canadians cited fear of being a burden as one of the reasons that they opted to die by lethal injection. And this is just another example of what happens when you're living in a culture that is increasingly opting for childlessness.
And your book tackles what you call the pornography pandemic. That's an interesting phrase to use, and the word pandemic. Explain why you chose that word, pandemic.
So I was using the word pandemic before we all went through the COVID pandemic. I find that now when I give presentations on pornography, it seems to be more triggering due to all the experiences everybody's had over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I chose the word pandemic because a pandemic really refers to a virus that spreads like wildfire. And what we've seen with the advent of the smartphone in 2010 is the rates of pornography addiction soar through the roof. So in Canada, the average age of first exposure to pornography is around the age of 9. The majority of young males consume pornography regularly. Now a majority of young females do as well. They attempted to do a study at McGill University contrasting students who looked at porn and students who didn't. They had to cancel the study because they couldn't find any students who didn't look at porn. And this is fundamentally transforming the way Canadians view sex and intimacy, which we've seen in stories like the Jian Ghomeshi scandal, where he claimed that he was simply living out a 50 Shades of Grey lifestyle when 13 women accused him of sexual violence. And the Toronto Star, Canada's most liberal newspaper, said that Jian Ghomeshi has been accused of unwanted sexual violence, thereby implying there's such a thing as wanted sexual violence. This was brought to our country by the widespread use of pornography, and it is a crisis and it is a pandemic.
And you say that some national governments are now expressing concern over the violent nature of today's porn. Even in the U.S., we've seen, like especially in Florida, we've seen government cracking down on it.
It's a great point because 10 years ago when I was debating this issue on the radio or at universities, people would kind of write you off as sort of a Christian prude. Now the view that pornography drives the rates of sexual violence up and that pornography is deforming the minds of a generation is a view held by the government of the UK. It's a view held by the governments of multiple states who are passing laws to prevent minors from accessing porn. It's a view held by the Attorney General of France who advocated for prosecuting pornography. I could give you a list of another dozen countries, but this is a secular consensus now that pornography and its widespread usage is deforming the minds of a generation, and that this is fusing violence and intimacy together in a way we've only just begun to grapple with.
And you express a lot of concern for our public health education system as well. Who is teaching our kids and what is being taught?
Well, that's one of the most interesting ways that I think the average Canadian has woken up to the reality that everything has changed in this country. That in 2025, we are not the country we were 20 years ago, because now children are being taught at the very youngest ages that there are up to 72 genders. You have the SOGI education in BC. You had the sex education implemented by the Rachel Notley government in Alberta. You have similar education in Ontario and right across the country. And these children are essentially being taught a version of anti-reality, that they can choose their own gender, that, for example, if they have traditionally tomboy type characteristics, this probably means they're transgender or born in the right body. And then they're being introduced to various sexual practices at very young ages. There have been scandals very recently in the last couple of months in Saskatchewan and other provinces where children were being taught very, very graphic and explicit, detailed how-to sex manuals on a variety of activities, many of them which I cannot mention on air, but all of them, I assure you, regardless of whether you're a Christian or secular, you would find horrifying to discover it was being taught to children as young as 10.
And this isn't just coming from our schools. This is also coming from social media. It's coming from Hollywood. It's coming from our TV shows, our movies. Talk a bit about the impact that social media and Hollywood has on us and our children.
Well, human beings are fundamentally people who define themselves by stories. And again, now the story of Western civilization is the story of the sexual revolution. And what we see is Hollywood telling those stories. The heroes of Hollywood are now the kinds of activists who pushed that. It's LGBT activists like Harvey Milk. It's abortion activists like Gloria Steinem. The companies of big tech, by and large, have been firmly co-opted by massive LGBT lobby organizations like GLAAD or the Human Rights Campaign. And so they promote Pride Month, which is in June. If you live in Canada, the Trudeau government now says we have a Pride season, which is June, July, August, and September, according to the Canadian government website. And so what we're seeing is the story put forward by the sexual revolutionaries, pumped out across social media platforms, told by the most talented and wealthy storytellers of our generation, and a generation of young people between schools, universities, social media, and Hollywood. They're absorbing that story as their own story.
Wow, I didn't even know we had a Pride season now. I just thought it was called summer. Now,
Well, you're paying for it.
where do you see our culture headed over the next decade, and what can we do to take a stand for what's right?
So there's a couple of different ways. In chapter 11 of my book, I describe how we need to create thick Christian communities where we are passing our values on to our children. We are sharing our stories and the Christian story with them so that they have an identity that is separate from the sexual revolutionary identity put forward by the culture. Where do I think we're going in the next decade? I think that we're seeing some real signs for optimism. I think the fact that the Trudeau government attempted to expand eligibility of euthanasia to those suffering from mental illness, that this was delayed twice and then halted, and that a conservative government would ban it is really encouraging in terms of protecting the vulnerable. I think the fact that Canadians born after 1988 are far more likely to be against abortion morally in almost all cases is incredibly encouraging trajectory. I also think what's going on in Alberta right now with Danielle Smith's legislation protecting minors from sex change surgeries is really encouraging, and I suspect we'll see more of it in the years to come.
Jonathan Van Maren is the host of the Bridgehead podcast and author of How We Got Here. Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
With the rising cost of living these days, it's having a serious impact on those who lack affordable housing. Thankfully, we have some dedicated people right here in Lethbridge and different organizations committed to providing help. Joining us to talk about some of the challenges for those who are living on the streets, the working poor, and those with addictions is Ken Kissick. Ken is the co-founder of Streets Alive Mission here in Lethbridge. Ken, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to this.
Me as well. Now, Ken, for those who are not familiar with your ministry, what is Streets Alive really all about?
Ultimately, Streets Alive is about making sure that we're looking after the vulnerable in our community, looking after their emotional, physical, spiritual needs. Ultimately, we're trying to connect them with Jesus Christ, and through that, be able to help their lives. But in the meantime, if they're cold, if they're hungry, if they're homeless, they're not willing to necessarily listen to good news. So we demonstrate the good news through our actions.
No, I love that. Ken, our temperatures here in southern Alberta can become very frigid during the cold winter months, as you're well aware. Can you explain how that kind of weather really impacts those who are living on the street?
Well, ultimately, we have an emergency shelter, but for a variety of reasons, there's a population that doesn't want to use those resources. And when they're caught out in the cold, as for example, this morning it was -8 or -9, that's frostbite temperature. And so these people are subject to frostbite. They're subject to hypothermia, all of those things. They're a vulnerable population. Their immune system's weak. So it can be deadly long before we think of those temperatures in -30 and -40.
So with inflation going through the roof and everything being a lot more expensive these days, are you seeing more people on the streets, or is it about the same?
Our homeless street addiction population continues to grow. It's just part of what we're doing. The inflationary thing, you're going to start seeing here in Lethbridge, what Calgary has been fighting with for a little while, and that's people living in motorhomes, trailers. They just can't afford housing anymore, and so they're reduced to, finding accommodation, and you'll have families living in a motorhome.
You know what? It's a story we recently had on Bridge City News. You're right. People who had to sell their homes, they couldn't afford their homes anymore, and are living in an older RV.
Yep, and that's coming. We're not keeping up with affordable housing, and unfortunately, it continues to have long-term effects. And once people start to lose hope, then they start to drift into the things that will take away that pain. And now you're into drugs and those kinds of addiction. And today's drugs will kill you pretty quick.
So from a lot of the people who you've interviewed, you've helped over the years, those who are battling drug addictions, is it a form of escapism for a lot of them? Or maybe they're hurting and maybe covering a lot of that pain?
Absolutely. No one gets up in the morning and decides they're going to become an addict. Addiction comes out of some form of trauma, and then that leads them into addiction. And I mean, we've got people that were involved in an auto accident, and then you're taking oxycodone or something for that pain, and then that just drifts into an addiction. You'll have others where you have abusive relationships, sexual abuse. You have long-term trauma, and ultimately the pain of the trauma, they just want to kill it. Today's drugs, unfortunately, are the fentanyl and the meth. They actually just take away all hope. Their whole sense of self-preservation is gone. We experience people outside our center with their fingers turning black who refuse to come in where it's warm because we won't let them bring their drugs. So they stay with their drugs outside. And then the next thing you know, they're in the emergency hospital having to deal with frostbite.
So do a lot of your volunteers use naloxone kits? Do you teach them how to use that to help somebody who may OD?
Yes. Largely it's our staff, but anybody that's involved in our outreach receive training on naloxone. Lately, we haven't had to do as much of that, but it's cycles. But yes, they're trained in that. They're trained in what we need to do to be able to help the people. We have staff that does intensive case management. We're working to help people through a navigation center to get off the street and out. Hence, the other side to us is our recovery programming.
Ken, I remember when I was there a few years ago and Julie took me on a bit of a tour, your wife, your beautiful bride there, and she showed me this beautiful mural of so many of the people who you've helped over the years, many who suffer from addictions, who are homeless, and many on that wall, she said, are now gone. And that just really tugged at my heartstrings, and it brought a tear to my eye when I saw that. And because a lot of these people you're helping, they become friends and family.
They do. We're very connected to them. This Lethbridge in southern Alberta in 2023 lost 153 people to overdose.
Wow.
That's significant. And it's going up because the drugs are deadly. And there's a new one. It's been out there for a while now. It's mixed. It's called xylazine. It's a horse tranquilizer, large animal tranquilizer. They're mixing that within it. And what that does is when people get injured, they get a cut, it doesn't heal properly. So we're dealing with massive infections. And we just heard that a couple of days ago that one of our street park people that had an infection in her leg and wouldn't deal with it passed away.
Oh, no. So, Ken, how can viewers really help your ministry? What kind of donations, and maybe do you need more help with volunteers at Streets Alive?
We're always looking for volunteers. Because we have a variety of areas. We have our repurpose center, which is collecting and helping with clothing and furniture for the immigrants and everybody else. We have our pin bank downstairs. If those that have a heart for outreach, we will train them, but it's not for the faint of heart. It's a real life changing ministry, and you got to be up for it.
I can see it also being very rewarding at the same time when you see the difference you're making in many people's lives and maybe how some of those lives are changed.
Our current outreach leader, I won't say her name, but she actually we got her off the street. She came through our program, and she has been clean for year and a half. Talented lady, very dedicated to reaching the hearts of the people, and that's just one of a lot of stories. Our addictions recovery program has we have about a 80% success rate of getting people past 120 days. We graduated over 90 people last year out of that program. We are seeing families reunited, fathers getting visitation rights with their children, getting back into productive society. So there is hope for these, and the biggest thing that we are trying to bring to the people is hope, because they have none. And they need healing, and there is only one healer. So that is our entire purpose, is to is to introduce people to the gospel of Christ and then walk with them as he ministers to them, bringing them out of that darkness. You know, we serve a God that brings people out of darkness into his marvelous light. And we're just one of the vehicles that he uses for that.
Amen. Now, Ken, you have your annual Coldest Night of the Year walk, which is coming up on February the 22nd. Can you explain what this is all about and how our viewers can maybe get involved?
So they just need to, right now it's open, the portal's open. They just need to type in Coldest Night of the Year or CNOY Lethbridge. They need to then find Streets Alive because there's two of us here. And then they just follow the links. They can either register. We would love people to put in teams, but everything is done online. How you raise your money, how you get people to donate, it's all there. It's very simple. And basically what it is, it's a 5K walk that will start at 5 o'clock on Saturday, the 22nd of February. You'll see the route in the website. We have hot chocolate and something after, but it's a family event. So we're encouraged, bring your families, walk in the cold. Now we've had days where it's +5 and we've had days where it's -25. But really it's designed to just give you an experience of what it means to be out in the cold for a while. It takes about 45 minutes to walk 5K. And so on those chilly days, you'll feel what a street person feels like, except they don't have a warm place to get into.
Now let's talk about another initiative that you have at Streets Alive. It's called Stuff a Bag for Streets Alive.
So what that is, you come on in here, get a blue bag. It's blue in color. It's called Stuff a Bag, and you stuff it. You stuff it with food, or you stuff it with clothing, socks, new underwear, whatever you want to stuff it with. And if you want to, you want to do it as a family, you take one or two of those to Walmart, and away you go, and you just stuff them. And we've seen them come in like you can barely carry them, but it's great. And we've had, if you're part of a small group, sometimes you come down, get 5 or 6 of them. Maybe you're leading a youth group, whatever. Anybody can be in it. We love them. They're great, and it's a great promotion this time of year.
And very rewarding, absolutely. Ken, you have some interesting programs at Streets Alive as well. Can you share a bit about Exodus Men's Life Recovery Program, and for the ladies, the Genesis Women's Life Recovery Program?
Correct. So this is what we call Recovery Road, and it includes the men's and women's recovery program. So this is a program by which people, once they've done detox, they've kind of started the process of getting down the road. They join the program. It includes safe, secure housing. So that's part of their program. And you do a 30-day initial, and then you do 90 days of programming. And then we encourage another 90, but really the 120 days, if we can get people kind of on the road in 120 days. And a lot of the people who come to the program, some of them are people who do know Christ and some don't, but almost everybody has engaged in a relationship with Jesus Christ at the end of that 120 days, which really is the key to their success.
Earlier, we chatted a bit about affordable housing and the lack thereof. Are you seeing more people on the streets who are maybe coming from the Middle East, from Ukraine, from other countries? Or is it kind of 50-50 between locals and those from other nations around the world?
The immigrants are well looked after. We don't see too many of those out there unless they've got caught up in addiction, okay? And then they're out. What we are seeing, though, is that downward push because of affordability. People can't afford a house, so you have a better class of renter. So then the landlords raise rents, and that just pushes down. So we're now starting to see we've already seen them, but more working poor, more families that struggle are getting pushed out. And in some cases, you now have 2 or 3 families living in a single place. They're packed together. That's not healthy. And then some of them, like you say, you start to see the tents and the campers, and they're just making a way. And unfortunately, we are still struggling with red tape and the ability to build affordable housing quickly in our community, or repurpose housing quickly. we need to deal with that.
Ken, how much help are you receiving municipally and from the province at the same time?
Little, not much. We have some grant applications and things out. I mean, we certainly have great support from our local MLA and municipal council, but they're restricted in just to how much they can do. And obviously, when things like the exhibition building and that thing comes up, it chunks into funds that they may have for other uses. But ours has always been our trust and faith in God and the people of God to respond to Him, and we're seeing great things. A lot of people are nervous about the postal strike. That it affects us. We get a lot of donations through the mail, but people are finding a different way to get to us, and they're getting it to us, and we're very grateful and blessed. Because ultimately we serve a God who always looks after us.
So Ken, I want to circle back to how you're really planting seeds for Christ here with your ministry. To what degree does faith in Jesus really impact individuals in their recovery journey?
Oh, it's the absolute key. Let's face it, all of our lives without Christ would be wasted because we would be in charge of ourselves, which was never good. The faith in Christ and their ability to allow Him in brings healing, it brings strength, it brings hope, because that's who He is. So that while we do all of this other stuff, it has a single purpose. If we are not introducing people to Christ, then we are wasting our donors' money and we're wasting our time. So we really try to focus. But that introduction comes through action. It comes through us living our lives before people and them seeing Jesus working in us and us being able to say, well, He'll work in you too. It is when you see that light come on in there, when they receive Christ and the light comes on, it is something that you can't describe in people's lives.
Ken Kissick is the co-founder of Streets Alive Mission here in Lethbridge. Ken, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and thanks for watching.